Okay, so we made it to the final part where we're going to review and kind of pull some concepts and ideas together and show you some of the information we've already covered in a slightly new way. And we'll primarily take a look at oxygen delivery and how those increase with training adaptations, as well as what some VO2 stroke output, stroke volume and cardiac output type factors look like between trained and untrained individuals. The very, very end, we'll just give a little review about the differences between strength and endurance training and some of these cardiovascular adaptations. But again, we covered a lot of this just generally throughout each video lecture as we were chatting about them, each topic. Okay. So again, in regards to oxygen delivery, we've spoke about previously how the difference between our arterial and venous blood is a major factor, and that is a good indication of how much, as we come to realize, our working skeletal muscle will pull out of our blood while we're working. And so what we're able to do is increase that oxygen delivery, right? And that's through blood flow, and in particular redistribution of blood flow, or increased cardiac output, and again an increase in the capacity for working muscles to pull oxygen from blood. Part of that redistribution of blood flow is our vasodilation, which we spoke about last lecture, where we get this increase of blood flow because of the opening of capillary beds, but we'll find with that we get that consequence of decreased blood flow because there's more volume in areas, in particular around skeletal muscle, to be able to take in all this blood flow. So we have vasoconstriction to help counterbalance that, and essentially muscle tissues and organs that don't need blood, we get that redistributed to the muscle. So things like our digestive system, to a degree our brain and other organs that aren't as vital, decrease in their blood flow and but that helps increase or at least keep blood pressure the same it increases blood pressure, but it counterbalances the drop from the vasodilation. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful, but we covered that quite a bit last lecture. Right, and then as we increase our intensity, heart rate increases and stroke volume increases. We spoke about that up here, where our overall stroke cardiac output increases. And last but not least, just to remind you, the different adaptations that come from endurance training in particular is increased stroke volume without an increase in max heart rate. So that's at rest that we'll notice we can see this effect as well when we're at rest. So our heart rate will stay low, but our heart volume or stroke volume is up, which will maintain our cardiac output. And then a decrease of heart rate at any given intensity. We're going to see a few slides here coming up that help demonstrate that, okay? And what that looks like, again, between trained and untrained individuals. So before we dive into this, with any graph, it's really good to just get yourself situated with the different axes and what each of them represent and tell us, and then look at the actual graph itself. So we'll start with the y-axis here, where we see it's heart rate, and that's beats per minute or beats over minute. And this makes sense. We have looks like around a resting or bottom heart rate, a low 50s or maybe even 40s, and then at most anyone would ever get to is we can see kind of around 220. So again, if we take a look, the top is percentage of peak VO2 trained. So this is a trained individual and what their maximum volume of oxygen is. Now, what does that mean practically? What does volume of oxygen kind of relate to in a practical sense? Well, you can think of that as a working capacity. And we'll see this illustrated in a couple of graphs, but the larger capacity to use oxygen to make energy, we can say we have a greater VO2 capacity, volume of oxygen capacity to consume. Similarly, we can think of VO2 as a work rate. So as our VO2 or consumption of oxygen increases, that can be an illustration of how much work output an individual is doing. Okay, so a couple of different ways to kind of view a similar concept. So when we're looking at these percentages, again, we have our zero or our rest here between our untrained and our trained individuals for their peak volume of oxygen consumption. But you'll notice that the untrained individual, their 100% ends before the trained individual. And all that reflects is that a trained individual is going to have a greater capacity to utilize oxygen to do work to produce energy. Okay, so now that we have these axes kind of situated, they're going to be the same throughout all these graphs, so I won't review it each time. But if we're looking at heart rate, here in the red, we can see an untrained individual at rest has a higher resting heart rate, which we know, and that it stays higher over the course of their workload up to 100%. So, so again, their hearts are working harder to do, to handle less of a workload. Okay, and I think that makes sense. So again, a trained individual is going to have a lower heart rate and be able to maintain that for a longer duration of time to a greater absolute VO2. Okay. Next up, we have stroke volume. Okay, so remember that's part of our cardiac output, which is next. Actually, let's go cardiac output first. Yeah, okay, so here's our cardiac output. Now you might notice, you're like, hey, wait, it's exactly the same for an untrained and trained individual for essentially the whole duration of this graph in this example. Well, yes, if you recall in our topic, we said at rest, a trained and untrained individual is going to have the same cardiac output. It's just the way that a trained individual's heart goes about maintaining that cardiac output compared to a trained individual is different. They're different, right? The other part that this illustrates is you do see the trained individual has kind of this extra little outcropping of extra VO2 capacity, cardiac output. And again, that kind of reflects that the untrained individual's VO2 ends here, and the trained individual goes a bit farther. So the absolute value, or the absolute number of cardiac output that can be achieved by a trained individual is greater than an untrained individual. And again, that makes sense if we think back to the two factors that contribute to cardiac output, being heart rate and stroke volume, which we'll see here. So again, these two factors kind of contribute into that, and sure enough, here we go. Here's our trained individual with a higher stroke volume, quite significantly relative to an untrained individual, which is lower. And we also know it takes a longer amount of time for a trained individual to get to a greater amount of their VO2. So this is their 50% mark here, and this is the 50% mark of the untrained individual, hitting a much lower stroke volume per beat. So that's every beat in milliliters, how much blood that is being pumped by the heart. Okay, and again, that's quite a significant difference. Again, not so much with heart rate, but definitely a big difference with stroke volume. Okay, and so again, if we think about how hard our hearts work, both at rest and at exercise, having this capacity of stroke volume to make up for a decreased heart rate is a very significant adaptation to exercise, in particular endurance exercise. Okay, we arrive here at blood pressure. We notice there's not a huge difference, but yes, the trained individuals do have lower blood pressure. And again, that comes from our vascular changes that allow a lower blood pressure to occur. Last but not least, we'll take a look here at VO2. It's the same thing that we've been speaking about the whole time, where our VO2 is lower for a untrained individual and absolutely has a higher total value of, in this person's case, just under 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute, whereas our untrained individual has about an average of 50, let's say. Okay. All right, so those are major cardiovascular responses in trained and untrained individuals. When we look at endurance versus strength adaptations, we can see that our endurance trained individuals are going to have an increased cardiac output. This makes sense, and that's the absolute number. Our increased oxygen delivery to muscle. We know this adaptation through a few things, both changes in our blood, but also the tissues themselves are able to uptake more oxygen, and we're going to see an increase in endurance performance that comes from that absolute capacity of VO2 increasing, or the capacity to take in more oxygen while we're exercising. For resistance training, we don't see a lot of the similar cardiovascular changes necessarily directly to our oxygen delivering capacity, but what we do see is an ability to increase cardiac output against the increase of blood pressures encountered during resistance exercise. So when we're working out, there's a lot of tension throughout the body, and that creates peripheral resistance to blood flow. So our hearts have to be able to keep pumping against that resistance. Okay? And so here's a chart summing a number of different things. We can kind of, okay, and so here we are resting. So at rest, these are adaptations that we'll notice between endurance and strength-based training programs, if we've done quite a bit of this. Yeah, let's go through it in some kind of grouped together aspects where we can. So here we're talking about the heart, in particular its anatomy, and we'll notice that both for endurance and strength training, we'll have increases in the muscle mass of the left ventricles. Okay. Our end diastolic volume of the left ventricle in particular will increase more for aerobic training. Again, that gets that Frake-Starling kind of mechanism being applied there. But also we have an increased volume of blood, which will also increase that end diastolic volume. Okay. Our stroke volume, again, increases for endurance, but not much for strength. And the reason for that is, if we recall, our heart rate comes down, our stroke volume goes up, and because of that, there's a little change in cardiac output, but it's more about that efficiency and is related to that end diastolic volume increasing. Our systolic and diastolic blood pressures in any trained individual is going to go down relative to an untrained individual, and again, that has to do with the vascular adaptations that occur. Our plasma volume, as I mentioned earlier, increases for the endurance training, so that has an effect up there, as well as an increase in red blood cell mass, but we don't get those same changes with strength training. There's some, depending on, like again, if you're working out in a very hot gym, for example, you're likely to see those increases in blood plasma volumes and some red blood cell increases as you're undergoing hematocrit concentration changes. But and we see there's very little again for strength training, but there's a slight decrease for endurance training individuals. Our blood volume increases again as a result of these two factors increasing. So there's little change there for strength training, and large artery capacitance definitely changes for our endurance trained individuals, and there's not really enough evidence there for strength training. Okay, and that is the conclusion of your cardiovascular system. Great, thanks for sticking through this. All right, we'll catch you on the next chapter.